Alright, in this video I would like to show you how to work with domains a little bit more, and towards the end I'm also going to show you how to use the gradient input as well as a custom preview. Now we've already encountered domain commands when we were using ranges. So just to repeat, if I've got a range, what it takes is a domain which gives it a start and an end point, and then a number of steps into which to divide this domain. So if I now put a panel at the end of this, you can see that by default it divides the domain from 0 to 1 in 10 steps, so we get 11 values at the end. Now if we want to change this, we can construct a domain, and by default this also goes from 0 to 1, but we can change this. I'm going to put in 2 sliders here, and let's have one that goes from 12 and another one goes to 24. There we go. Now you can see that we're dividing the space between 12 and 24 in 10 steps. And remember, we can also have the start be higher than the end. So let's say we go from, let's say 50 or 48 in this case to 100, then we're going from 100 to 48, of course. So it starts at 100 and then it ends at 48, and between that it's divided into 10, and we can also of course change that, and now it's going to give us 21 items because it's doing it in 20 steps. And we use this range command to construct points, and that's exactly what I want to do now as well. So construct points, and I'm actually going to change the domain from 0 to 100 and 10 steps as per default. And I'm going to plug this into X and Y. And now, if you recall, if we graphed one of these two inputs, we will actually get a grid like this. And I'm actually going to then, if you look at it here, you can see that we've then got all these lists with our points in it, and I'm actually going to flatten that to get a single list. Now, why did I do that? Well, I want to build an attractor map with you guys. So an attractor map means that I'm going to use these points as a center point of circles, and then I'm going to change the radius of the circle depending upon the distance of the point to a line that I'm going to draw through this grid. So depending on the distance of each point to that line, the circle around that point is going to have a different radius. So next step is of course to start drawing circles. And if we use a point and plug it into this plane, by default it will take the world XY plane and position that on top of that point. And if we zoom in, you can see that we've now got a circle at each of these points, but the radius is not changing and it's also set to 1. Now if we change this, say, to 10, we get overlapping circles, and as we decrease it, we get smaller and smaller circles. All right? Okay, so how do we go about getting the distance from this curve to these points? Well, first of all, we need to input this curve into, whoopsie daisy, wrong command. Here we go, curve, set one curve, select our curve, and we're done. And from these points, we are going to use the curve closest point command, because that not only determines the closest point on that curve, but it also gives us the distance. So if I now plug in this curve and this list of points, you can see that we get the closest point, and out here we get our distance. I'm going to put this in a panel. And here we go. Now, if we plug in these distances, which are going, I don't know, all the way to 70, and so forth, the circles we get will look like this. So we've got lots of overlapping circles, and that's not exactly what we wanted. We want to control the minimum and maximum dimension of those circles. And for that, we're going to use domains. Now, if you go to the domain block, you will see several commands. And one of those commands is bounds. And this actually lets us determine what the smallest and largest number in one of our lists is. So if we look at the output of those bounds, it's outputting a domain, and a domain always consists of a start and an end. Now, if we want to get at those values individually, we need to deconstruct this domain. So deconstruct domain, and make sure to select one-dimensional domain because we're not working with two-dimensional domains here. And if we then plug this in, we get a start, right, 0.42427, and an end, 71.456, and so forth. Now, as you can now tell, these circles have got radii going from 0.42 all the way to 71 something. What we want to have is something, let's say, circles going from 5 to 12. So we now need to construct a domain and then map one domain to the other. So I'm going to go construct domain, and let's get rid of this panel. So our start is going to be at, say, 5. And the end is going to be at 12. Right, so this is the domain that we want to map to. And this is the domain from which we're starting. So what we now need is a remap numbers block. And this takes 3 inputs. It takes the values that are supposed to be remapped. In this case, this is our distances. It takes a source domain, and the source domain is, of course, the domain of those distances. So it goes from 0.42 to 71. And now we're going to remap all of those distances to a target domain, which we've said is 5 to 12. And if we now plug these in, we actually get something a little bit more sensible. So I'm going to hide a few components so that we can see a little bit better. Let's hide that and hide our curve and our closest points. So now we've got a curve and we've got our circles, and the ones closest to the curve have got a small radius, and the ones far away have got a large radius. And we can now play with these values. So I'm going to decrease it a little bit here and also at the end so that we don't get an overlap. Make it maybe even smaller. And because those whole numbers aren't really giving me enough control, I'm going to change both of these sliders to real numbers. And for even finer control, what you can do when you're moving a slider, you can actually hold the control key and then it moves. You get a finer control of that slider. So let's go all the way to there. So what's happened? If you look at our original distances, they were going from 0.42 to 71. Now we've taken all of these numbers and remapped them to a domain that starts at 1.984 and goes all the way to 4.8. So if we look at what's coming out of this remap block, you can see that the 6.12 turned into a 2.21, the 3.28 turned into a 2.097, and so forth. And once again, we can actually flip the start and the end. So let's say we want to have the big circles in the middle and then smaller circles at the edge. We can just flip those two inputs. There we go. So that's the remap domain command. We know how to get the bounds of a domain and how to split those into a start and an end. Now with these circles, I would like to go a step further. Let's get rid of these panels. And actually, I'm going to fill these circles with a surface. I'm going to use a boundary surface. Now we've got filled circles in a sense, because we've got a surface inside of each one. I'm going to hide the actual circles. And now I'm going to colorize them. And we can do that if we go to the, where is it? Display. And we've got preview, custom preview. Now a custom preview takes 2 inputs. And you can see that it actually doesn't produce anything, it only changes things in the Rhino viewport. It takes a geometry, our surfaces. So I can now actually hide these surfaces and only use the custom preview ones. And then it takes a shader. And you can get really fancy with creating custom materials, but we are simply going to use a gradient of color. And that's an input block. And so right now we've got a gradient going from pink to red. And if I plug this in, nothing will happen because we've got no inputs here. So I'm going to disconnect this again. Come on. There we go. Now, what does this gradient take as inputs? It takes a lower limit and an upper limit of that gradient range, and then points within that range determine where along our gradient the color is going to be. So if I simply take our original distances and then plug in the gradient, nearly all the colors will be the same because only very few values will actually be under 1. So what we actually need to do is we could use our remap numbers, but then the domain still wouldn't be going from 0 to 1. So what we can do is we can change the lower limit and the upper limit. And to do that, we're going to deconstruct this original distance domain. And we've already done that here with our start and end. So let's move this down here. And I'm going to use the start. So the lower bound of our distances, that's the lower bound for the gradient. And the end, so the upper bound of our distances as the upper bound of the gradient. And now you can see that we actually have a gradient of color that changes with the changing radius of that of those circles. Now, as always, there's also a different way to do this. So instead of changing these lower and upper bounds, we could actually remap the distances again, only this time to 0 and 1. So I'm going to get rid of this and use another remap command and construct myself a domain which goes from 0 to 1, which it does by default. So I can just plug this into our target. The source domain is still our distances, and the values are the distances themselves. And out comes a set of numbers. Let's look at it in the panel. I go from 0 to 1. I'm going to plug these in to here. And you can see that it still works. And now we could also, once again, flip things. So if I want to have, say, the pink at the edges and the red in the middle, what I could do is I could change these two domains. So I'm going to go 1 here, so that it starts at 1 and ends at 0. And now we've got the red in the middle and the pink at the edges. Now, that's not the only color gradient you can use. You can define your own gradients, but there's also a bunch of presets which you can use, like black and white or the classic jet color. All right, so that's how you can use domains, showing you how to determine what the bounds of a domain are, how to get at the start and the end of that domain, and how to remap one domain onto another. Thank you for watching.